The story that I have for you today is one that took Sri Lanka by storm, not just when it happened in 2005, but again in 2019 and then in 2024, decades after the crime. This is the story of a 19-year-old Swedish Sri Lankan, a young girl much like any of us, and someone she had warned her family about for months. This is the story of power, influence, and justice. This is the story of Yvonne Jonnson. Hi everyone, welcome to the Desi Crime Podcast, a show where we dive deep into some of the craziest cases from around South Asia. I'm your host Aishwarya.
And I'm Aryaan.
And the case that we have for you today is heartbreaking and tragic. Aryaan, this is an episode that we've covered before on our audio-only podcast.
Find it on Spotify, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to audio-only podcasts. But the reason we are covering it today is not just to present it in video format and to our YouTube audience, but audio listeners, there have been some major developments in this case that we'll be covering. And of course, it's one of the first episodes we ever did, and an episode that shook us to the core, an episode to which the victim's mother reached out to us. So it was a very pivotal episode for us when we covered it some 5 years ago. But take me through that journey of Yvonne Jonnson all over again, Aishwarya.
Yvonne Jonnson is a beautiful, vivacious, lively girl born to Swedish national Roger Jonnson and Sri Lankan national Kamalka Jonnson. To her parents and her younger sister, 17-year-old Caroline, Yvonne is the light of their life. She's intelligent, she's hardworking, and she's everything they wanted in a daughter and sister. In fact, through her hard work, in 2005, 19-year-old Yvonne had moved to the United States to attend fashion school. She was pursuing her long dream of becoming a fashion designer. Life was clearly going well for the Jonnson family. Roger and Kamalka were happily married, very much in love, and they adored both their daughters beyond words could describe. In July of 2005, Yvonne was back in Sri Lanka from the US and living with her parents at the Royal Park apartment complex in Colombo. July is when summer vacations are well underway across the world, and so I'm certain she was in Sri Lanka because of that, enjoying the time of her life in a very tropical and beautiful country. When Yvonne was in Sri Lanka, she spent her time with her parents, hanging out with her sister and her sister's new boyfriend, a 19-year-old boy named Jude. They would all hang out together, go to clubs together, and do basically what any other 18 and 19-year-olds do. Now, Yvonne and Jude had studied in the same school together. They both went to Colombo International School, a prestigious school in Sri Lanka's capital, and so they knew each other beforehand. You know how when you hang out in the same circles, cross each other in the hallways in school, yet don't really know each other? That was the equation between Jude and Yvonne. And besides, Caroline and Jude only began dating when Yvonne had already left for the United States. So now Yvonne's back. They're all friends, they all hang out, they all have fun, everything's great. It's the 30th of June and a Friday night in 2005. The clubs across the capital were raging with parties, and Yvonne and Caroline decided to go out together. At 8:30 in the night, the sisters asked their father if they can take his blue Jeep out over to a friend's place for a party. And their father says, "You're going out together, but make sure you come back together too." The girls agree, and they're out for a fun night ahead. But before they reach their party, they stop by a big, affluent house at Bagatale Road, owned by Jude's very wealthy and very well-respected parents. Jude is actually the son of reputed businessman Preeti Jayamaha, the owner of the very famous Coronation Bar and Restaurant in Colombo, and also owns several highly sought-after catering services. So basically a very wealthy, very rich, very well-known family in Sri Lanka. The two girls pick Jude up from his apartment and make their way to a pub called the White Horse. At White Horse, they catch up with 4 other friends of theirs. They dance, they party, they drink up a bit, but eventually they all kind of get bored of the place and decide to go over to another club in the city called Glow. When they enter Glow, it's totally not what they were looking for. It's absolutely dead that night for some reason. There weren't enough people, there was no good music, there was no DJ playing, and within no time, they're out of Glow as well. They all sit down and discuss where to go, and they soon make their way to another pub called the Blue Elephant. Now, even though they're at the Blue Elephant, the rest of the night, the group actually keeps going back and forth from one club to another. From the Blue Elephant, they get bored and they go to a Holiday Inn where they meet up with a Korean friend of theirs. From the Holiday Inn, the group and the Korean friend go back to the Blue Elephant. Finally, at around 12:30 in the night, they're all at the Blue Elephant and something happens while they're there. From later reports by Caroline, apparently there was a guy in the club, someone they didn't know, and this individual waved at Caroline from a distance. A report mentions that this stranger's name was Pavitra and that he and Caroline ended up talking for a bit, while other reports don't mention them talking at all. While this seems like a small, normal detail and, a normal incident, it's a club. It's a place where people are drunk, it's just kids, young adults fooling around. Sometimes someone will flirt with you. But to Jude, this incident didn't sit well. Soon, the group notices Jude and Caroline fighting over the issue. Jude is visibly angry and Caroline begins to cry. Everything we know from beyond this point is a little blurry and varies from report to report, but we know that later on, Jude comes forward and claims that night, Yvonne stepped in to stop the couple from fighting, but ended up taking Jude's side in the argument. He says Yvonne agreed that it was Caroline's fault and that Jude was justified in being angry. However, Caroline comes forward and tells a very different story. She says her sister couldn't see her crying, and so she steps in and scolds Jude in front of everyone for upsetting her. Caroline says Yvonne took her side and that she had done nothing wrong for Jude to get angry the way he did in public. By this time, the night is down in the dumps. They didn't find a nice place to party, and the fight had ruined everyone's mood. At this point, Jude and Caroline just decide to call it a night and go back home, while Yvonne and her Korean friend decide to party some more. Eventually, they go back to Glow, the second club that they had visited that night, and by now, it's 2 a.m. Jude and Caroline are together in the Royal Park Apartments, the building where Caroline and her family stay. According to Caroline, Jude left for his house in a cab about 30 minutes after they had come back home. Yvonne and her friend party a bit, but then her friend leaves her in Glow and goes somewhere else. Eventually, by about 2:45, at around the same time that Jude calls a cab to go back to his house, Yvonne was back at Royal Park. And that's how the night ended for everyone. It's the next morning now. It's 6 a.m. and Roger Jonnson, Yvonne and Caroline's father, wakes up and begins to get ready for work. Before leaving, he goes over to Caroline's room just to make sure his daughters are back, but realizes Caroline is not in her bed. He then goes over to Yvonne's room and finds the door locked from inside. He assumes the girls are asleep inside the locked room, but just to make sure, he goes over to his sleeping wife and wakes her up. He asks if she knows where the girls are, and his wife says the girls are back and they're asleep. Roger breathes a sigh of relief. He exits his 23rd floor apartment, but while exiting, finds a note on the door written by Caroline to Yvonne. The note says, "Wake me up when you come home." He notices the note, doesn't pay much thought to it, gets into his lift and leaves for work. Now, if I reached my home late at night and saw a note from my younger sibling saying, "Wake me up when you come home," and I enter the house, I probably would remove the note behind me. Maybe this is just me reading too much into it, but I find it a little bit weird that if Yvonne was inside the house, she hadn't removed the note off the door.
In retrospect, it's weird, but in that moment, I don't
Maybe
think
you didn't even see it in that moment.
Yeah, like it wouldn't stand out. Like, yeah, I mean, but I wouldn't do this long arithmetic of what it could bore or anything, because
100%.
life is chill.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree with Aryaan on this. They were all getting drunk, they were inebriated. It's understandable if Yvonne didn't even notice that note and if it wasn't such a big deal to their father the next morning. They also had a really, really long night with fights and God knows what else. So I just presume that maybe I'm thinking too much into this. Anyway, just a few hours after Roger Jonnson leaves for work, Kamalka Jonnson wakes up and goes over to her daughter's room to wake them both up. However, she only finds Caroline in the room and there's no trace of Yvonne. She quickly wakes Caroline up for her classes but asks where Yvonne is, and Caroline doesn't know. As Caroline begins to get ready for her classes, she notices a text on her phone from her boyfriend, Jude. She responds to it by telling him that her sister never returned home last night and that she's a little worried. To that, Jude replies, she must still be rocking it. Caroline then proceeds to call the Korean friend that they were with last night, and that friend tells her that she left Yvonne at Glow and hasn't seen or heard from her since. Caroline and her mother, now worried a little more but still hopeful that Yvonne will return, leave the house for class at 9. But on their way, Kamalka felt so uneasy about not seeing her daughter the entire night that she asked the driver to take them back home. The feeling of uneasiness for her increased so much halfway through that she just had to go back home and figure out where her daughter was. By around 9 am, the exact time when Kamalka and Caroline left their house, the Royal Park building was bustling again. Understand, this is Colombo, it's the capital of Sri Lanka. If there's an apartment complex, it's bustling. People were in and out of their houses for their morning walks, and domestic helps who worked in the apartment were starting to arrive. Now, you guys remember the Korean friend I told you about, the one that they were all hanging out with last night. She too stayed on the 16th floor of the Royal Park building, and that's just a few floors below the 23rd floor house in which Yvonne and her family stayed. That friend's domestic help, Sheila Anthony, arrived at 9 am that morning, her normal time to arrive. This is what Sheila Anthony recalls from that morning. Quote, I work as a domestic help for a Korean family on the 16th floor. I usually work from 9 am to 5 pm. On Friday, July 1st, I came to work at 9 am. I was asked by the lady of the house to go to the 19th floor to give some things to somebody staying on that floor. I left the 16th floor around 9:30 am. Because the lift was taking a long time to come down, I decided to take the stairs instead. End quote. When Sheila reaches the stairs of the 19th floor, what she sees lying there will change her life forever. According to her, she still gets flashes of the sights she saw on that fateful morning, even today. Lying in a pool of blood, she sees the body of a girl. Sheila screams, and she's so terrified that she stumbles off the stairs and falls on the floor below. Once she gathers herself, she runs to the office of the building manager, Mr. Chandrapala, who initially laughs at the matter by telling her that she probably just saw a ghost. When Chandrapala finally realizes something is seriously wrong, he goes over to the scene and sees the body lying in such a peculiar way, he thinks it's a doll and that some kid from the building played a prank. I can't begin to imagine how peculiar a body needs to be for it to be first recognized as a ghost and then a doll. The body of this girl was naked from the waist below. Her jeans were pulled down to her ankles, not completely off, just pulled down to her ankles, and it was those same jeans that were wrapped around her neck, as if they were used to strangulate her. The head of the body was clearly smashed against something with high impact, and the sheer amount of blood in which the body was found made the scene almost unreal. I can't begin to imagine what this crime scene looks like. Soon, Chandrapala identified the body as that of 19-year-old Yvonne Jonnson. The police are called over immediately, but upon arriving, they realize there was nobody in the Jonnson house. Roger Jonnson is at work, and Kamalka is on her way back from home after feeling uneasy and not knowing where her daughter was. When Kamalka and Caroline return, they see the number of police officers standing outside their apartment and immediately know something is wrong. The cops wait for the two women to enter their house and sit down before they pull out a photograph of Yvonne, a photograph she always carried in her purse. Kamalka says the moment they pulled out that photo was the exact moment she knew something had happened to her daughter. She even today speaks of how she didn't walk over to the crime scene with her husband and daughter because she didn't have the courage to see her daughter like that. At noon, Roger Jonnson receives a call at work from a friend of his. He picks up, not knowing his life is about to change forever. The caller on the other side asks him to come back home as soon as he can. And Roger gets into his car and reaches Royal Park at 1:30 that afternoon. He enters his house and sees it filled with police officers. He makes his way over to Yvonne's room, where his wife and young daughter were sitting and crying hysterically. He was in that room when he was informed that his 19-year-old daughter, the light of his life, was no more. They tell him Yvonne has been murdered. Unable to believe the words that come out of the cop's mouth, he asks to be taken to his daughter's body right away. 17-year-old Caroline follows him to the staircase of the 19th floor, but nothing could have prepared Roger and Caroline for how their daughter and sister was murdered. According to Roger, Caroline remained silent for days after she had seen Yvonne's body. Quote, her head had been bashed to the floor and her jeans had been removed and tied around her neck. The position in which my daughter lay had been disgusting. Her whole head was gone. I sat near her body for over an hour. How can a father see the body of his child in such a position? End quote. From the reports of the medical examiner, we can try to recreate what happened to Yvonne that night. Yvonne reaches home at around 2:45 am and meets someone outside her apartment. Something happens outside the apartment on the 23rd floor that makes Yvonne run down the stairs. As she's running down the stairs, that someone catches a hold of her, and Yvonne and that person get into a struggle. In that struggle, that person hits Yvonne repeatedly and breaks her ankles too. Despite the broken ankles, Yvonne continues to run down the stairs, and we know this because of the vast trails of blood that were found throughout the staircase. Yvonne's earrings and other belongings were all found scattered on the staircase between the two floors and likely fell as a result of the struggle. Somewhere close to the 19th floor, the person smashes Yvonne's head on the floor so hard that her skull breaks into 63 different pieces. After doing that, this person then goes on to remove her jeans from her waist and tie them around her neck to strangulate her. The cops also find that Yvonne's wallet was missing from her bag. Sometime after this, whoever did this to Yvonne took the clothes with blood on them and disposed of them in a manner that they would never ever be found again. According to the autopsy report, the main cause of Yvonne's death was strangulation by her own jeans. The police immediately seal the building and specifically the area between the two floors. They speak to all of the family members and recreate the last night they had all seen Yvonne alive. They find out about the clubs, the partying, the drugs used in the parties, and all the people present there. They find out about the fight and how everyone returned back home. Caroline proceeds to tell the police information that will later become critical to trying to solve this case. She tells them that she hasn't heard from her boyfriend Jude the entire day. She says the fact that he hasn't texted or called even once is very unusual, especially because he usually texts and calls her several times a day. The police are intrigued, not suspicious, just intrigued. They want to know who Jude is and what is his relationship with Yvonne and all of this. Kamalka and Caroline are called in for questioning and tell the cops that Yvonne and Jude had known each other ever since they were 9 years old and that they had studied in the same school. However, Caroline claims that Yvonne never liked Jude and had tried to talk her out of being in a relationship with him. Yvonne had also called her mother several times from the US just to tell her to prevent Jude and Caroline from being in a relationship with each other. She tells her mother about Jude's use of drugs, his abuse of alcohol, his damaged family life, and its results on his psychological health. She also tells her mother and sister about how Jude was suspended from Colombo International School after disciplinary action was taken against him for using drugs in school. Caroline also knew that Jude had previously gotten a girl pregnant in that school. But despite all of this, and after ignoring her sister's warnings, Caroline chose to give him a chance, and that's how they both started dating. Quote, "My sister had warned me several times to not associate with Jude. She and Jude had known each other for a long time. I had also known him since I was 11. Although he had shown interest in being with me several times before, I finally accepted in February. My sister had been very angry when I told her. She knew he was a spoiled kid involved in alcohol and drugs." End quote. Kamalka added to this, Caroline was a very bright kid in school. She topped all of her classes. However, ever since she started dating him, her grades dropped. Yvonne was very worried about their relationship. If only we had listened to her warnings. End quote. The police find out that Jude's parents had a bad marriage and the problem started when he was just 1 year old. Eventually, his parents separated, but his life at home did not improve. They learned that he had shown violent, aberrant, and rebellious behavior ever since he was very young. And now, one day after Yvonne's body was found, Jude was seemingly missing. He wasn't taking anyone's calls and not responding to anyone's texts. One full day after Yvonne is found dead, Jude finally comes out. He goes over to the Jonnson house to pay his respects to the family. As soon as the family sees him there, though, they call the cops and inform them that they can come and take him in for questioning. The cops arrive, they take him to the police station, and Jude begins to tell them a story. He tells them how they had all gone partying 2 nights ago, how he and Caroline got into a fight, and how Yvonne had supported him, something Caroline disputes. He talks about how he went over to Royal Park at around 2 with Caroline, and how he called a cab and left at around 2:20 without ever meeting Yvonne again. After the questioning is over, the cops begin to try and verify this story. They reach out to his friends, they try to find the cab that he must have taken, and slowly but surely, Jude's lies start to unravel. A close friend of his, Shafraz Mohammed, comes forward to tell the cops that on the night of the murder, he received a call from Jude asking him to pick him up urgently from Royal Park. Initially, Mohammed said, quote, "It's too late, I can't come right now, my parents need me, they'll know why I've left the house." But Jude pleaded with him multiple times, begged him, and said, "I'll always be your friend if you come and pick me up." Finally, after long insisting, Mohammed agreed. When Mohammed arrived at Royal Park at around 2:50, he finds Jude walking towards the car in a pair of boxers instead of the pants he was wearing earlier that night. He was carrying his pair of jeans in his hand. Cops would also later find out that night, when he reached the car that Mohammed was in, he was wearing a shirt different from the one he was wearing earlier that night. The taxi driver who came along with this friend also came forward to independently verify this entire story. The medical examiner later verifies that there was a partial palm print found on the railing of the 19th floor, made with blood, and that it matched the palm print of Jude. Jude also eventually admits to having taken a bath in the swimming pool of the apartment complex before he called his friend with a taxi. When trial begins, prosecution uses a great deal of evidence to convict Jude Jayamaha. Quote, they used the bloody palm print, the fight that ensued, Yvonne's dislike for Jude, the fact that the clothes Jude was wearing that night have never been found, his admission of bathing in the swimming pool, something prosecution says he did to remove the blood from his body, and much more. The defense, in turn, paints its own picture. They claim, through their own analysis, that the palm print was only a partial match and thus inconclusive to the case. They claim that he came out of the building in his boxers because he had had sex with Caroline that night, something Caroline has vehemently denied ever since. They also brought up a pair of shoes submitted to the police which had no traces of blood on them. According to the defense, had Jude killed Yvonne and been at the crime scene, the shoes would have shown at least some traces of blood. They also constantly claim that there was no animosity between Yvonne and Jude and no motive for him to kill her this violently. After a lengthy and cumbersome trial for the Jonnson family, the judge rejected the defense's side. The judge claimed 19-year-old Jude Jayamaha had in fact taken the life of 19-year-old Yvonne Jonnson. As the verdict, the judge announces that Jude Jayamaha would face life imprisonment and would spend what was a very long life ahead rotting behind bars. The family and the nation breathed a sigh of relief. While they had all wished for Jude to receive the death penalty, they were happy they received at least some form of justice. They thought the justice system did right by them. But a few years later, in 2012, Jude submitted an appeal to the court. In a move that would severely backfire for him, the Attorney General of Sri Lanka would ask the courts to in turn consider making his previous sentence even more strict and putting him on death row. In a move that shocked the nation and brought the family a silver lining of happiness in so many years, Jude Jayamaha was put on death row and given the death penalty. The now 26-year-old was to be hanged. The family and the nation rejoiced. People had faith in the justice system and everybody believed Yvonne was finally done justice. Her murderer was going to see the same fate he had decided she would see. I can imagine how happy Yvonne's family must have felt when they heard the first verdict, which was a decent form of justice, life imprisonment. But their happiness would be on a different plane altogether when it was the death penalty. But don't feel so happy so soon. In 2015, there was a transfer of power at the highest level of government in Sri Lanka. The president changed. Maithripala Sirisena took over office after being elected. And surprise, surprise, the position of a president comes with the ability to pardon criminals that are on death row. Now, if all of your minds are wondering why Jude Jayamaha, why would this new president pardon this specific death row inmate convicted almost 20 years ago after committing a crime labelled the worst murder in Sri Lanka in the last 200 years? Why this man? In true Desi fashion, Sri Lanka learns that its new president is the distant relative of Jude Jayamaha. Jude's stepmother was related to the new man. In 2019, Maithripala pardoned Jude Jayamaha on grounds that when he was convicted, he was just 19 years old. The nation realizes just how fragile justice is and what happens when it's left to the hands of corrupt politicians. After he was let out, Caroline, now 31 years old, spoke to a news channel and said, quote, I will never return to this country. This country has ruined our lives. I've lost a sister and a home. I will continue to fight till my sister's murderer gets the punishment he deserves, end quote. Speaking to the news, Roger Jonnson, along with his wife Kamalka and Caroline, said that they now had no hope remaining for justice. And you know what? The entire time Jude Jayamaha was in prison, he had access to a cell phone, got to meet people whenever he wanted, and was treated unlike any of the other criminals in there. For the last 20 years, he has maintained his innocence and kept pleading not guilty. He kept trying to petition his case and get a court to find him wrongfully convicted. In fact, even until right before he was pardoned, he maintained he hadn't killed Yvonne, and the courts had made a huge mistake. But if you think this case is over here and nothing can be worse than this, pardoning him was the worst thing that could have happened to the Jonnson family, just wait. Just 5 days after Jude Jayamaha was pardoned by the president, he released a letter to the public. In that letter, he said sorry for killing Yvonne.
I don't remember this.
Yeah, fully admitting to the fact that he did it.
But that's a confession.
It is. But he was pardoned after having been found guilty,
right? So yeah, you can't
he
be
is
then
guilty.
Because of the statute of limitations, you can't be reconvicted if you've been pardoned or something like that.
There's a change to that. We'll see.
But in India, I'm pretty sure if you've been pardoned, I don't think it can't be reversed.
In a lot of countries, that is true. Yeah.
Is that not the case in Sri Lanka?
Apparently not. Jude accepted in his letter that on that fateful night 20 years ago, he was the one that took her life. Now, this is where we had left this case off when we covered it for you on our audio-only podcast as our 8th ever episode in 2020. After he was pardoned, Jude fled Sri Lanka to a country overseas, with his location remaining a mystery to the media for all of these years. But then, in November of 2024, as the year was nearing its end and Yvonne's family were preparing to face another year without their daughter and another year with her murderer roaming free across the world, the Women and Media Collective of Sri Lanka challenged the pardons, which prompted the setting up of a Supreme Court bench. This bench deliberated the case, studying the reason for the pardons, and decided, in a move that shook the country, to put Jude Jayamaha back on death row and order his extradition back to Sri Lanka. The Attorney General of Sri Lanka is now responsible for tracking down Jude and bringing him back, a task that may take many more years. But at least in the eyes of the country, Jude Jayamaha is a guilty man.
Aishwarya, while I am not for capital punishment, and so insofar as that, I can't principally agree with bringing somebody back to kill them as a punishment for killing somebody. If anyone has seen this guy, we'll put sort of the email or contact of the Sri Lankan police or whatever is the relevant authority, and please reach out and
keep your eyes open.
I hope justice can be done to Yvonne.
Absolutely. If you like what we do here at Desi Studios and absolutely love what we're wearing today, this is merch you can go buy all for yourself.
You can buy this Desi Crime merch in our YouTube store on the link down below at Karak Merch. Keep the engines at Desi Studios rolling so we can pay our videographer right behind the camera to make these amazing episodes just for you.